So I have a new favorite R.F. Kuang book. It is Katabasis, which is coming out in August of this year. And Harper Voyager, the publisher, was so kind to send me an early copy, which I read immediately because this was my most anticipated release of 2025. So today I figured I'd share like a spoiler-free review of the book, as well as discuss some books that I think would be helpful to read beforehand, because there are a lot of literary and mythological references. To be clear, you do not have to read those books to enjoy the story. It's just like a way to elevate the reading experience and give you further grounds for analysis. But I am so excited to talk about this book, so without further ado, let's get into it. Katabasis is an ancient Greek noun that means the story of a hero's descent into the underworld. So Katabasis is about these two graduate students who must set aside their own rivalry to journey to hell to save the soul of their professor. This is a story about the struggle and the hellscape that is academia. It's a story about finding connection in your own meaning in life, as well as learning to appreciate the small things that you get to experience. As for genre, I would say this is a philosophical dark academia fantasy book. This has a love story component, however, it is not a romance book. I repeat, it is not a romance book, which appears to be the impression that some people are under. I would say that the publisher comps for this are pretty accurate in terms of the genre expectations that it's setting. It's being officially comped to Dante's Inferno, as well as Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. Another book that I thought was like tonally similar to Katabasis was The Secret History by Donna Tartt, specifically those first few chapters where the characters are in the classroom discussing the nature of morality, immortality, and beauty and terror. I think if you like those types of discussions, you'll also be interested in like the philosophical basis of this book. But yeah, this book is pretty dark and gritty, so just don't go in expecting like a contemporary rom-com or romance. In terms of writing, I would say the first 100 pages are pretty dense. A lot of literary and mythological references, and you're really getting like thrown right into the midst of things. This is written in a nonlinear narrative, which I thought was like a great structure for the story that it told, and you have that information and key exposition being delivered throughout the course of the book. I also do feel like this book is pretty well paced, and I do think it's like the best pacing in any R.F. Kuang book I've read. I think largely the nonlinear narrative contributes to how the story moves along effectively. So yeah, I was a fan of the pacing. As for prose, I think R.F. Kuang has a style that flows pretty well. I would say her writing style is probably most similar to Susanna Clarke's out of like all the authors I've read, and it definitely has a very academic dimension to it. Katabasis has fantastical elements set in a primary world, which means that it's set in a world like our own, and before like this whole underworld segment, it is set at Cambridge University. As for the magic system, it's like a system based on analytical reasoning and logic, and I do think this magic system is a great way to discuss, explore, and critique academia through the world building, and not just through like the themes and the discussions between the characters. And it's kind of hard to explain like how this power and magic is derived from the system without going into a specific example, which would be kind of a spoiler. But overall, I think it's just kind of the perfect magic system for this book. So this is written in the third person, and there are two main characters. There's Alice Law and Peter Murdoch. Those are the two graduate students who journey to hell. And I also do think this is R.F. Kuang's best character work. I have had some issues in some of her other books where I felt like her characters weren't necessarily three-dimensional. Like I feel like a lot of the times they were being used as mouthpieces to propagate certain ideas or themes, especially in Babel. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I do think some books are able to move forward more effectively when that character work is established in that format. It just isn't really like how I prefer to have my characters introduced in the books I'm reading. That wasn't an issue I had in this book. I felt like the characters really could stand on their own. And there was actually one chapter in here, like chapter 22. It's one of Peter Murdoch's chapters where, you know, like sometimes you're reading a book and like the characters, like it's a little bit fuzzy. Like you have a good sense of who they are, what their desires are, but like you can't really like refine that image. But like in chapter 22 of this book, after I read that chapter, it just like suddenly became clear. Like Peter just popped out of this book for me. He became like a character that I felt like I could really understand. Another thing I really liked about this book is R.F. Kuang adds like a lot of little details about these characters, like somebody's favorite piece of classical music, which I'll actually talk about in like the music section of this video later. And there even are some minor characters in here who I thought were really well developed and interesting to follow throughout the course of these chapters. As for content warnings, which I know some people were concerned about and asking about, I would say the biggest ones are suicide, sexual abuse, and animal cruelty / death. So I do know some people consider it a spoiler if somebody else like says in a review that like they cried or they didn't cry. So here's your warning that if you want to go into this emotionally blind, just skip past this next section. I made sure that this section was last so you could just skip right over to the reading guide segment. But here's your countdown. 3, 2, 1. I did cry during this, but I wouldn't say I cried because it was like a tragedy. It was more that there was like some bittersweetness to the story that I found really moving. I could also personally relate to a lot of aspects in this book, so I think that's like another reason why I was personally invested. But I will say I did think this ending was pretty satisfying. I'll leave it at that. Alright, now for the reading guide or the list of books to read before Katabasis. Let me be clear again that you do not have to read these books to enjoy the story. Like, she does allude to a lot of literary and mythological characters and lines and texts, but for a lot of these references she does explain them. There are some references that she doesn't explain, they're just like dropped in through the dialogue, but they're not central to the understanding of the story. But I'm someone who really likes to understand the context of references and allusions, and if you're the same way, then some of these books should be on your TBR before you start Katabasis. So there are a lot of books I want to discuss. I'm going to break them down by segment. The first segment I'm going to call like tier 1. These are the books that I think were the most heavily referenced in Katabasis. Tier 2 is like books that were referenced in passing, so not really central to the story, but maybe like a character or a quote or idea was dropped somewhere in the dialogue or in the text. In tier 3, I'm going to attribute to books that are like thematically or tonally similar to Katabasis. Definitely not necessarily to read beforehand. They're more of like a taste of what the book will be like, but like I said, not referenced, just for fun. So that's probably kind of the structure that I'm going to move in throughout this list of books. So if you only have the time or only want to read one book before starting Katabasis, I would recommend that one be Dante's Inferno. This is one of the books that Katabasis is officially comped to, and it probably is like the closest comp. This is the first part of the Divine Comedy, which is a 14th century narrative poem written by the Italian poet Dante Alighieri. So the story follows like a fictionalized version of Dante himself, who is journeying through the 9 concentric circles of hell, guided by the ancient Roman poet Virgil. There are like a lot of literary and mythological references in this book as well, as we journey through each of the circles of hell, which is really cool. This is a deeply Christian poem. It's about the journey of a soul towards God and the recognition and rejection of sin. As for the translation I read John Chardy's translation. I don't speak Italian, so I can't say like how accurate the translation is, but I can say that I found the translation to be pretty accessible. And this specific version here, this is from Penguin Random House. I think it was like $7, so very affordable. But I really liked how this one also had like some pictures. You know, look at that. So yeah, I would recommend this edition. Speaking of Virgil, the Aeneid by Virgil is another book on this list. This is a Latin epic poem written by the Roman poet Virgil that follows Aeneas, who is a Trojan who escapes the fall of Troy and travels to Italy, where he becomes sort of like an ancestor to the Romans. This book is on this list because there is a journey to the underworld that's referenced in Katabasis, in which Aeneas journeys to the underworld to receive a prophecy. In this book, he also encounters a character called Dido, who makes an appearance in Dante's Inferno. I believe it was like in the 2nd circle of hell, but there is a lot of interconnectedness between Virgil's The Aeneid, Dante's Inferno, and Katabasis. Another epic poem on this list is The Odyssey by Homer, and this is one of my favorite classics. So this is an epic poem divided into 24 books that follows the Greek hero Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, as he journeys home after the Trojan War. As part of this journey, he does go to the underworld, and that journey is referenced in Katabasis. On this 10-year journey, Odysseus also comes across many mythological figures, several of which do appear in Katabasis as well. As for like which translator to read, Robert Fagles was the translator I read for both the Odyssey and the Iliad when I first read them. This was before Emily Wilson's translations came out, and I feel like that was the main translation being taught in schools. I have since read Emily Wilson's translations, and I have been really interested in reading them because Madeline Miller loved them so much, and I love Madeline Miller's retellings. Emily Wilson also retains an iambic pentameter in her translations, and it's difficult to say which one I would recommend. I think Emily Wilson's translations are maybe a little bit more accessible, although I think Robert Fagles does a good job of making his language accessible as well. I'm not a classicist. I cannot speak to how accurate this translation is. This is just my thoughts on the stylistic nature of the texts. Another Homeric epic, the Iliad, is another book I'd recommend, although this one isn't referenced as heavily as the Odyssey and Katabasis. This actually precedes the Odyssey, so if you have time to read both, I would read this one first. And it's set towards the end of the Trojan War. Some main mythological figures that you may recognize who are featured in the Iliad are Achilles, Patroclus, Agamemnon, and Hector. And this is another great classic. It's also one of my favorites. I love both the Iliad and the Odyssey. And yeah, I do think these books are books that everyone should read at least one point in their life, so you might as well read them before you read Katabasis. Ovid's The Metamorphoses is another narrative poem that makes this list. So this follows a mythio-historical framework that includes 250 myths across 15 books. Book 10 features the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, which is probably one of the most famous depictions of a journey to the underworld. I will say the story of Orpheus and Eurydice shows up in a few different sources. This is the only one I've read. I believe the two other sources it's mentioned in are the Georgics by Virgil and the Bibliotheca by Apollodorus, which is like a compendium of Greek myths. So the last book or poem that I would consider on like this tier 1 list of books to read before Katabasis is The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. This is regarded as one of the most important English language poems written in the 20th century, and R.F. Kuang does directly quote lines from it. It does also include references to Dante's Inferno and Ovid's Metamorphoses, among other things, and themes include spiritual emptiness, post-war disillusionment, and death and decline. I will say I found this poem to be pretty challenging to read when I read it 2 or 3 years ago. That said, I'm also not someone who's particularly skilled in reading and analyzing these types of poems. I did have to read like some analyses from other people afterwards, and that helped me a lot. So I would recommend doing the same if you feel like maybe you didn't understand the poem to its deepest level. If you're looking to ease yourself into some of T.S. Eliot's works, I would recommend 4 Quartets. That was my personal favorite of his works and one that I found to be more digestible. It's a meditation on time and memory with a lot of beautiful lines, and it is actually one of my favorite poems of all time. So the next 3 books I'm going to discuss were referenced in Katabasis, although they were mentioned in passing through like character dialogue, so not to the extent that some of the books in the tier 1 list that I had were referenced. But I think it's actually kind of more fun sometimes to be able to recognize some of these smaller references, because you're like, oh, I know where the idea came from. I know where that character came from. I know the context of this idea. And that's just something that's pretty exciting about the reading process. And I'm sure there are many references that I did miss in Katabasis. These are just 3 of the small ones that I caught. The first one is from Huis Clos by Sartre, or No Exit. This is a play about like this existentialist portrayal of the afterlife in which these 3 souls are stuck in a room with each other for eternity. I read this one in December. I absolutely loved it. And the reason why this book is on this list is because there is a really famous line from it that was referenced in the first chapter of Katabasis. Another book on this list is God is Dead, God Remains Dead, and We Have Killed Him by Nietzsche. Now, the idea of like God is Dead, which is one of Nietzsche's most famous and controversial ideas, is directly referenced in a discussion between some characters towards the end of Katabasis. So Dante's Inferno is a very religious text. This is a critique of religion, and I do think it's really interesting to have read both of these and to consider the same topics of like sin and injustice and corruption through both of these lenses. The third book I'd recommend in this segment is Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Now, I admittedly read this in high school. My frontal lobe was not developed. I don't know what I was reading. I do need to reread this book. But I did recognize a character in Crime and Punishment that was brought up in the same discussion that God is Dead was brought up in Katabasis. There were 3 other works that I recognized as being referenced, but I haven't read these 3, so I did want to like separate them out and be transparent about that. But they were Paradise Lost by John Milton, The Republic by Plato, and Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. Alright, last segment of books. These 4 books I would say are like somewhat thematically or tonally similar to Katabasis. I will emphasize again, I know this is a lot of books. You do not have to read these to understand Katabasis. This is just all for fun if you want to read more books. The first one on this list is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This is the other book in the official publisher comp. I actually don't think Katabasis is super similar to this one. I would say it's actually more similar to Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by the same author, but because Babel was already comped at this one, I imagine they wanted to do something different. That's my guess. Piranesi is a book that's really hard to describe. It's also a book that I think you best go blind into, but it's essentially about this being who lives in a labyrinth, and that's all I'm gonna say. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, also by Susanna Clarke, was actually my read before Katabasis showed up in the mail. I was like 1 chapter in when I dropped this to read Katabasis. This is like an alternate history sort of book set in England about these 2 magicians who change the course of history after they bring magic back into the world. R.F. Kuang has cited Susanna Clarke as an inspiration. She actually even blurbed it. It says, "The book I wish I'd written, R.F. Kuang." And I could definitely see how Susanna Clarke's writing style has influenced R.F. Kuang. The Secret History by Donna Tartt is another book that R.F. Kuang has cited as an influence to her writing, and this is about a group of New England students who slowly lose their morality as they seek to transcend the triviality of their own lives. I love this book. This is kind of a staple of the dark academia genre. I would highly recommend if dark academia is a genre that you want to read more of. And like I mentioned earlier in this video, the first 2 chapters of The Secret History are pretty tonally similar to Katabasis. The last one here is the Myth of Sisyphus by Camus, and this one I was actually pretty surprised wasn't referenced more in Katabasis because it's pretty similar both in terms of like the underworld theme with Sisyphus as well as just the absurdist themes that I think are also present in some aspects of Katabasis. I will issue a content warning on this one. This is a meditation on suicide, and like one of the most famous lines from this book, which is actually on the cover of the Pink of Great Ideas edition, is there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. I also wanted to say one thing about the Pink of Great Idea editions. I think this is a great way to get into philosophy. I own several of these books. Actually, the edition of God is Dead that I showed earlier in the video is also a Pink of Great Ideas version. I'll just read you like what the purpose of these editions are. But throughout history, some books have changed the world. They have transformed the way we see ourselves and each other. They have inspired debate, dissent, war, and revolution. They have enlightened, outraged, provoked, and comforted. They have enriched lives and destroyed them. Now Penguin brings you the works of the great thinkers, pioneers, radicals, and visionaries whose ideas shook civilization and helped make us who we are. So Penguin essentially took like all these major ideas. A lot of these come from longer texts that are maybe not as digestible. So I think it's really great that they kind of packaged them up in these shorter forms. And if you do like what you've read in like the shorter version, you can read the expanded version. I would highly recommend looking into some of these Penguin Great Idea texts if you're interested in learning more philosophy. So those were all the books, and I did also want to mention that I made a playlist for Katabasis. I'm someone who really likes to make playlists of books after I read them. It's just like a way for me to process my thoughts. I grew up doing classical music, and it's just something that I've always loved. But there were like some classical musicians specifically cited in this book, and there is a lot of classical music inspired by the underworld. So I have included several of those pieces in the playlist, as well as some pieces that I feel like just capture the vibe and the essence of the story well. But yeah, I think that's all for today on Katabasis. Hopefully this video was interesting or informative in some way. If you have specific questions about the book, please let me know in the comments. I'll answer what I can. I don't want to get in trouble by spoiling anything because I don't want the publisher to regret giving me this arc, but I will, like I said, answer what I can. I'm so excited for more people to read this, and I definitely do want to do a reread at some point.